few months back, a coworker of mine found out that I used to be in the Marine Corps. I don't talk about it a whole lot, and my life took such a turn after I got out that you really wouldn't think I was former military just from looking at me. So when he found out, he was so surprised that he came to ask me if it was true. The actual story of him finding out is pretty boring, so I'm sure you won't mind if I skip over it. And then, since me and him had gotten pretty close over the years, I didn't mind answering all the questions he had. I ended up telling him a few funny stories from my days at Paris Island, and then eventually we got into the topic of deployments. I told him I'd been in Iraq from 2004 to 2005, and more specifically, how I'd taken part in what became known as the Second Battle of Fallujah. At one point, he asked if it was scary, and while that might seem like a dumb question on the surface, it's one that required a complex, multi-layered answer. Sure, there were times when I felt frightened and afraid, but during most of the firefights I took part in, all I really remember was feeling mad about it. Someone starts shooting at you, and yeah, it gets your adrenaline up faster than you can say incoming. But it's like one split second of abject terror, and then you and your platoon mates are like, "Oh, you effed up today, mister," and you're just angry. I'd get scared for other people more than I got scared for myself. If it's me running from building to building, I'm focused on 101 things, but not so much my own safety, if that makes sense, because I'm doing my job and helping protect my buddies. But then, if it was someone else doing something dangerous and I could see it happening, that was way worse. Because it was sort of like, am I about to watch one of my friends die? And sometimes they did. But that initial fright of contact and the fear your buddies were going to get killed, those weren't the same thing as what I'd call horror. When I say horror, I'm talking about being so afraid that you start to panic, freak out. The kind of feeling you get when something starts to feel almost supernatural, and you just want to, as they say, nope the hell out of there because you are way, way out of your depth. Imagine how terrified you'd be if you legitimately saw someone turn into a werewolf in real life. It's not just fear and confusion, it's shattering the laws of reality as you know them. Mind-bending, soul-shattering, grown man pissing his pants kind of fear. I only felt that feeling once in my whole career in the military, and it was in a half-finished 2-story house in a Fallujah neighborhood named Jolan. Without boring you with too much of the strategic and historical stuff, Fallujah was probably the toughest fight the Marine Corps was involved in since Sioux City, Vietnam, and we also faced a much different enemy in Fallujah than we did anywhere else. In the south of Iraq, you had your Shiite militias like the Mahdi army, while in Baghdad, it was a lot of former Iraqi army guys that had gone to ground and were conducting an insurgency from the shadows. But then in Fallujah, it was like the international jihadi all-stars over there, and the opportunity to take on the good old US of A attracted a lot of talent. You had Al-Qaeda-aligned terrorists from all over the world descending on Fallujah, and a lot of them were only still alive because they were very good at what they did. It was the Second Battle of Fallujah before the first had been a wake-up call to our commanding officers. The enemy were dug in like Alabama ticks, and they were being taught urban warfare and booby-trap manufacturing by guys that had been fighting in various theaters for almost 20 years by that point. As soon as they realized that, our COs pulled us out of Fallujah, called for reinforcements, then got working on a much more intricate plan to take the city without completely destroying it in the process. And so, a few months later, there I was, fighting from house to house with tanks and Cobra support. In terms of the actual fighting, Fallujah was kind of like chess. Each building in a city block was sort of like a square on a chessboard, and winning each engagement was all about where you had your pieces on the board. Only, imagine you're playing a game of chess, and you can't see where some of your opponent's pieces are until you put one of your pieces in the same square. This meant that every so often, we had to send an assault team out into dead ground in order to secure a building on the enemy's flank. This was not an enviable task because, while sometimes you got lucky, sometimes you didn't, and the enemy had a real knack for surprising the crap out of us. And so this one time, me and 3 other guys are sent out to a building surrounded by a high wall. Recon had spotted a singular hole in the outer wall, which made the whole place great for defense, but it also meant the building was being used by the enemy, who'd most likely blown the hole in the wall themselves. Recon hadn't seen any movement around the building, but obviously, that didn't mean there wasn't anybody there, so we had to be extremely cautious during egress. We sneak up to the wall, climb through the waist-high hole in the concrete, then start making our way towards the first door we see. We stack up outside, but as we do, we can hear this dude inside shouting out some Arabic name because he's heard us and he thinks we're his buddies. He's shouting, "Mustafa, Mustafa," then when Mustafa doesn't talk back to him, we heard him start to panic. We knew we had to force entry right then and there, otherwise this guy might potentially alert his friends, so one of us pushes open the door. As soon as the door opened, our saw gunner sees the guy right there in the hallway in front of him, AK in hand, and this look of pure shock on his face. The guy tries to bring his AK to bear, but it's too late. Our saw gunner put a burst of about 15 bullets into the guy's chest and stomach, and he dropped like a sack of potatoes. We leave his body lying there in the hallway, dead as a goddamn doornail, and 3 guys head downstairs to watch over the surrounding area while I'm left watching a window that overlooks the hole in the wall. It was a very simple task. Watch the hole and shoot anyone who tried to climb through it that wasn't American. A few minutes go by, then one of my buddies upstairs shouts down at me to go grab the dead guy's phone. Stuff like that was of huge intel value, and since he had the point of entry covered from an upstairs window, I was safe to move without having to worry about the enemy sneaking into the compound. I step out of the room, walk out into the corridor, and instead of a dead body lying there, with 20 bullet holes in him, there's just a pool of blood and no body. The dead body had disappeared. And right away, I'm like, guys, we got a situation down here, because obviously dead bodies don't just get up on their own. We'd already cleared the ground floor, so we knew no one else could be inside with us. But the thing that really freaked me out is there were no drag marks, just a pool of blood, and then a few drops leading off into another room at the back of the building. When it hit me that our dead body had just stood up after being shot 15 to 20 times, I felt this chill run through me. It didn't make sense, not by any natural law. I'd looked at him with my own eyes and I knew that he was dead. So how in the hell had he just stood up and walked off? One of my buddies comes downstairs and we start slowly making our way to the doorway that the drops of blood are leading to. We decided to toss a grenade in first, but then the second the grenade went into that room, we just heard boots against the concrete before the wounded enemy fighter comes hurtling out of the room with a knife raised above his head, ready to stab us. In all fairness, a lot of the time these guys shouted something before they shot at you or came running at you like this guy did, but on this occasion, this guy was completely silent, and his eyes were so wide they looked freakishly large as he came round that corner with his knife held high. All I could do was back up to keep from getting stabbed, but even though my buddy behind me put at least 2 or 3 more shots into him, he kept on coming at me with that knife. It was literally like a zombie movie, dude. I was yelling, "Shoot him in the head, shoot him in the head," over and over, but my buddy's gotta get up real close with his barrel at an angle where he's not going to kill me too. It was really touch and go for a while there, but eventually my buddy's able to get right up close without getting himself stabbed and pulls the trigger 3 times, boom, 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 until the attacker's head just disintegrated and he stopped moving. And now I'm sure a lot of you will be thinking, okay, this guy has to be bullcrapping me at this point because no one in the history of medicine survived 20 shots and then just kept on fighting. Well, believe me, this guy did. And it's not because he was a zombie. It's because he was on drugs. Later on that day, after conducting a deeper search of the building we'd taken, we found all kinds of needles and bottles of adrenaline and amphetamines. These insurgents had been shooting the stuff up and then going into battle wired on stimulants so they'd be less afraid and more aggressive. It didn't really work for them, I guess. It just made them stupid for the most part. But when it came to being able to sustain injuries and keep fighting, I never saw anything like it anywhere else. It really was like being in a zombie movie, and it wasn't just like that with that one guy. I know dozens of Fallujah vets that have stories like this, of having to shoot a guy in the head just to get him to stop moving. I don't got many stories like that, just the one, but I'm sure you'll agree, it's enough for one lifetime. This is a letter from my late great-grandfather. The summer of 1914 felt electric, like the way the air feels before a lightning storm. My friends and I, all from the same small English town, were caught up in the fervor of patriotism sweeping through the country. Then, when the news came that Britain was at war, it was as if a switch flipped in us. We gathered at the local pub, where the air was thick with talk of duty, honor, and adventure. Someone suggested we all volunteer together, and before we knew it, we were all nodding in agreement. The idea of a pals battalion where friends could serve together seemed very appealing at the time. We'd known each other all of our young lives, and the thought of going into this great unknown alone was unthinkable. But together, I knew we'd be unstoppable. And so there we were, signing up, our names going down on the recruitment list one after another. There was laughter, a lot of backslapping, and not even the slightest clue of what we were actually getting ourselves into. We were young, naive perhaps, but driven by a sense of comradeship and the belief that we'd all be back in time for Christmas, and we dived in head first. The training was tough, but seeing as we were all there together was also a good laugh. But then beneath all that bravado, there was this undercurrent of something more serious, something we couldn't quite put words into. We were going off to war, but not just a local scrap. We were wading in global conflict, and at the time, I'm not sure that registered with any of us until it was too late. As we marched to the train station, the whole town came out to see us off. Our families, neighbors, even the kids from school. They cheered and threw flowers as the local brass band played, but I could see the worry in my mother's eyes and the forced smiles my father put on so as not to ruin the moment. We didn't know then what we were truly volunteering for. The mud, the gas, the endless trenches. All we knew was we were doing it together, as pals. And as the train pulled away, amidst the cheers and all the waving, a part of me, a very small, scared part, wondered if this was really the adventure we all thought it would be. And by the year 1915, we were all stationed in a place called Ypres in Belgium. The day was like any other, filled with mud and rain and the constant sound of artillery, and we thought war would be exciting. But no one warned us of how bored we'd get in between action. We were told to be on high alert for gas attacks, but we didn't really believe the Germans would do something so terrible. Not to the mighty British Army. There'd be hell to pay. We were told to practice putting on our masks at a moment's notice, and told the effects on casualties could horrify. But nothing could have prepared us for when it actually happened. It was late in the afternoon when, suddenly, the air started to smell strange, like a mix of rotten eggs and bleach. Then I remember watching as the sky turned yellow. Someone shouting, "Gas, gas, gas," and we all scrambled for our masks. I managed to get mine on, but not before breathing a little bit first. And it was agony, but I managed to get through it and breathe properly. But then around me, it was complete and utter chaos. Men coughing, choking, and some fell before they could even reach their masks. I saw my friend Robert trying to put his on, but he was too late. He fell to the ground, gasping for air, but all that filled his lungs was deadly gas. It was thick too, very thick, like a dense fog you could see but not quite touch. It burned my eyes even through the mask, and I heard men screaming. Some were running blindly and others just lay there where they fell. We were told to stay low. The gas was heavier than air, but staying low meant staying near the dead and dying, and we waited for what felt like hours. The gas cleared slowly, but the damage had already been done, and it was devastating. When I took off the mask, that rotten smell still hung in the air, and all I could hear were the groans of the suffering and the dying. We had to move the wounded, and there just were so many of them, we didn't know where to begin. I saw men with burns on their skin, their eyes red, swollen shut, and some were coughing up blood. And to me, it was a vision of hell. That night, not a single person could sleep. Every cough, every wheeze reminded us of that gas attack. I kept my mask close, even inside our dugout, and we were all terrified it would happen again in the night, and then we'd awake too late to do anything but cough and choke and die. That night was bad enough, but it was only the next day that we saw the full extent of the horror. Bodies of friends and enemies all mixed together, some contorted in pain, others looking like they were just asleep. And we had to bury them quickly. There was no time for proper burials, just a hole in the ground. I helped carry Robert's body. He was heavy, but I felt nothing but numb. There were no more tears left inside me. We covered him with dirt, and I said a silent prayer, Not just for Robert's soul, but for all of us that were still alive and had to go on facing the horrors of war. Christ be with us, because the days after were filled with much fear. Every sound, every wind shift made us think the gas was coming back. We were told that mustard gas was used, something new and terrible. It didn't just kill you right away. It could kill you slowly with blisters, with lungs that never worked right again. And I survived that attack, but it was never the same. My lungs hurt for months, and I would wake up coughing, thinking the gas was back, and I saw men who survived the gas only to die later from their injuries. I say all this to let you know, I left that war a different man. The memories of that day, the smell, the sounds, they stayed with me. And I learned to live with the memories, but I've never forgotten them. I know that true peace will only come when I'm as dead as old Robert is. May he rest in peace, and may I see you soon. I am in Sarajevo, and the city is under siege. I live in a small apartment with my family. We do not go out much because it's too dangerous. There are bullets and bombs all around us. Every day we hear the sounds of war, and it's a constant reminder of the chaos that now grips our city. The windows of our home are broken. We cover them with plastic and blankets to keep the cold out. It's winter, and there's no heat. We wear our coats inside, but the cold gets into our bones, and we huddle together for warmth, sharing stories of better times to distract from the harsh reality. Food is hard to find. Sometimes we eat what we can grow on our small balcony, and we've managed to cultivate a few vegetables, but it's never enough. Other times we wait for the UN to drop aid from the sky, but the snipers shoot at the aid trucks, so we don't always get food. When we do receive aid, it's like a small party, making us feel grateful for the help of others. My brother was outside one day looking for water. There are no taps working, so we just go to wells far away. And he never returned, and I heard later that a sniper had shot him down. My mother cries a lot now. She doesn't talk much. Even her silence is filled with sadness. My father is always trying to fix something in the house or find us something to eat, and he keeps himself busy, maybe to distract himself from the pain, I don't know. We listen to the radio for news, but it's never good, and we hear about peace talks, but nothing changes here. They say the war will just go on. Every day feels exactly the same as the last. Bombs, bullets, silence. Then more bombs, more bullets, and news that someone else we know has been killed. And the violence seems endless. I go to school in the basement of our apartment building. There are no real schools anymore. We learn by candlelight because there's no electricity. Our teacher tells us stories about peace, about how Sarajevo was before the fighting, and it's hard to imagine now. The tales of normal life feel like fairy tales from another world. I miss my friends, and some have moved away and some are gone. The classroom is quieter now with fewer students each day, and one day I found a cat hiding under our building. It was skinny and scared, and we took it in, and we shared what little food we had with it. It sleeps on my bed, and it makes the nights less lonely. Its purring is one of the few comforts we have left, a small reminder of the joys of life. There are times when we hear a big explosion and we all run to the safest room, the one with no windows, and we sit there, waiting for the next sound. Sometimes there is silence after, and we think maybe it's over, but then another explosion comes. We've learned to be afraid of the quiet, knowing it could just be a moment before more violence. One day, there was no fighting for a whole morning, so we went out to get water. It was quiet, but we knew that it could start again any second. We ran to the well, filled our buckets, and ran back. And that night, we drank the water slowly, like it was fine wine, and every drop felt like a precious gift, a moment of normality in a world turned into a nightmare. I dream of peace. I dream of walking in the park without worrying about snipers. I dream of school, real school, not the basement. I envision a city where children play without fear, where families can sit down for meals without the constant threat of disruption. But dreams do not change what is happening. We wait, we survive, and we hope. I write this in my diary because if we survive, I want to remember. I want to document our struggles, our resilience, and our fleeting moments of happiness. I write about the good things too, like when we laugh at something small or when the sun comes out after days of hiding. But mostly I write about the fear and hunger and death. It's important to me that these experiences aren't forgotten, even if they are painful to recall. This is our life now. We don't know when it will end, but we keep going, day by day, because we must. Each morning when we wake up, we're grateful for another chance to live, to love, and to hold on to hope in spite of all the despair. The siege continues on our area, but so does our willingness to endure and our willingness to survive. It's commonly accepted that following Hitler's invasion of Poland, the Second World War commenced on September 1st of 1939. However, there are some who argue the war truly started 8 years earlier during September of 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Back in the mid-19th century, Japan remained in the iron grip of the Tokugawa shogunate. The shogunate established a kind of medieval feudalism known as shi no kosho, with samurai warriors occupying the highest social strata, and its closed country policy of shokoku aiming to limit trade, foreign influence, and the spread of Christianity. The policy led to a flourish of artistic and cultural advances, yet as you can imagine, prohibition of free trade led to significant economic downturns. By the mid-19th century, the food shortages caused by financial stagnation led to violent demonstrations among the Japanese peasantry, exposing the shogunate's weaknesses and hastening its inevitable downfall. Then finally, in 1868, Emperor Meiji was reinstated as the nation's divine leader, marking the beginning of an era known as the Restoration. The Meiji Restoration marked a pivotal moment in Japanese history for a number of different reasons. Firstly, the nation began industrializing like never before. Thanks to the introduction of steam-powered machinery, the Japanese silk industry experienced an unprecedented boom, while the introduction of the country's first railroad system saw productivity skyrocket. The Japanese established a telegraph system in their first national bank, along with their first power plants and large-scale factories. They wished to emulate the success of Britain and the United States and work closely with their new Western allies to drag Japan into the 20th century. The effort was a resounding success, and by the early 1900s, Japan had transformed itself from an insular island nation into a major regional power. Perhaps the best illustration of Japanese advancement is the result of the Russo-Japanese War. For hundreds of years, control of the Korean peninsula had been one of the Japanese military's supreme goals. But Imperial Russia, with its considerably larger army and navy, believed they could simply sweep the Japanese out of the way in their claim to both Korea and northern China. The Japanese attempted to peacefully negotiate, but the Russians seemed happy to let war decide the outcome. Yet this proved a grave error of judgment on their part. On February 9th of 1904, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet, which was based near the now Chinese city of Dalian. It provided a devastating blow, and was followed by Japanese victories at Luchuankou and Mukden. The Russian Baltic Fleet sailed over 20,000 miles to support their beleaguered ground troops, and in May of 1905, they destroyed the combined Japanese fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. But it was too late. The Japanese had made significant inroads into China's Manchurian province, but it wasn't merely their victories which forced the Russians to sue for peace. In just over 19 months of fighting, the Russians had incurred around 160,000 casualties. The Japanese, on the other hand, had suffered almost 500,000. But unlike the Russians, whose will to fight was beginning to waver, the morale of Japanese soldiers remained extremely high thanks to their unshakable belief in both country and cause. A peace treaty was signed in September of 1905, with Japan being granted huge swaths of Manchuria. With the process, mediated by the US and UK, the Japanese came to view Britain and America as potential allies, so much so that at the outbreak of the First World War, Japan actually sided with the United Kingdom and began attacking German colonies in China and the Pacific. After a month-long siege, the Japanese flushed German soldiers from the Chinese city of Tsingtao in November of 1914. They also wrestled the Mariana, Caroline, and Marshall Islands from the hands of the Hun, and provided invaluable support to the Australian Navy in its hunt for the German warship, the SMS Emden. The Japanese proved to be an incredibly effective ally, and naturally, they were incredibly proud of their contributions to the war effort. But when peace finally came in November of 1918, the Japanese felt their efforts went unrewarded. Believing they'd been allowed to keep their territory they'd fought and died for, the Japanese were stunned when the Western powers ordered them to cede control of certain Pacific islands. They were also dismayed to discover that huge tariffs would be placed on their goods during peacetime, as a wave of so-called protectionist trade policies swept the globe. As a result, Japan's silk and agricultural industries began to suffer. But then, in 1923, Japan was hit by the most devastating natural disaster in its recorded history, the Great Kanto Earthquake. The earthquake is believed to have been the worst in Japanese history, and the extent of the destruction was nothing short of horrific. More than half of Tokyo was either leveled by the quake itself or engulfed in the flames that followed, while the port city of Yokohama was virtually obliterated, with more than 90% of its structures lying in rubble. The cities of Kawasaki and Yokosuka both received extensive fire damage, while numerous smaller towns and villages across Kanagawa, Saitama, and Ibaraki prefectures received extensive damage. In just 4 minutes and 48 seconds, hundreds of years of hard work and progress had been utterly laid to waste. Central Japan lay in ruins, and it was here that the seeds of militarism were first sown, and the fertile soil of national humiliation and economic instability. Without stable peacetime industry to devote themselves, the Japanese population turned to its generals for purpose and direction. The days of making war against the Russians and the Germans had been glorious, filled with pride and productivity, and as the factory doors closed, the ranks of the imperial army swelled dramatically. Japan's generals promised to guide its citizenry in the same way they guided their soldiers, to victory at any cost. They preached the doctrine of kokutai, which demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor and the state, and revived the ancient samurai ethos of Bushido, where ultimate honor lies in glorious self-sacrifice. Glorification of Japan's military victories crept into the nation's schools, where students were instilled with martial values, taught that the Japanese were a divine people, and told the country was destined for expansion. Any public figure or politician who suggested otherwise was targeted for assassination by either violent militants or members of the Japanese military. By 1931, despite their reverence of the divine Emperor Hirohito, the Japanese military was firmly in control of the state apparatus, and for many years prior, they'd been preparing for war. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when, and every soldier in the Imperial Army knew all they had to do was wait. At least until one soldier stationed on the Japanese-owned section of the South Manchuria Railway grew tired of waiting and decided to hatch a plan. One evening, in September of 1931, Colonel Seishiro Itagaki was musing over the Japanese concept of gekkokujo. Gekkokujo is a Japanese word which describes when someone in a lower position of power overthrows someone in a higher position, using either military or political might. And in the opinion of Colonel Itagaki, Manchuria presented the perfect opportunity for gekkokujo. The local Chinese garrison at Shenyang seemed poorly trained and poorly motivated, while Itagaki's troops were well-disciplined and well-equipped and positively itching for a fight. He knew that, given the opportunity, he and his soldiers would inflict a crushing defeat on the numerically superior Chinese. So, in order to get that opportunity, he decided to manufacture consent. On the night of September 18th of 1931, Colonel Itagaki ordered one of his soldiers to place explosives near the train tracks. When those explosives detonated, Itagaki told his superiors that they were being shelled by Chinese artillery and begged for the opportunity to subdue the local Chinese garrison. He was granted permission, and the next morning, 2 Japanese artillery batteries opened fire on the local Chinese garrison. The ensuing infantry assault was so swift and ferocious that a Japanese force of just 500 defeated more than 7,000 Chinese soldiers. The war in the Pacific had begun, and when the Japanese Prime Minister tried to stop it, he too was assassinated in cold blood. China had been embroiled in civil conflict since the 1920s, and although Japan had invaded territory that is now part of the People's Republic, the Chinese and Japanese governments were not officially at war yet. That all changed in July of 1937, when following a skirmish with Chinese forces, the Japanese officially declared war and began the full-scale invasion of the Chinese Republic. By August, the Japanese had captured Shanghai, but not without strong resistance and heavy casualties, and seeing as the Japanese were vastly outnumbered and far from home, General Iwani Matsui realized a single fatal strike was necessary to collapse the Japanese government and end the war. And so, he volunteered to lead his army in a march on what was then China's capital city, Nanking. Chinese General Dong Sung-di announced he and his garrison of 81,000 soldiers would defend Nanking to the death. But government officials, recognizing that the defenders were made up of untrained conscripts and wounded veterans, evacuated the city less than a week before the arrival of Japanese troops. But it wasn't merely their rapid advance which scared the Chinese so terribly. It was what the Japanese did along the way that struck terror into their hearts. Historian Peter Harmson asserts that the 170-mile strip of land between Shanghai and Nanking was transformed into a nightmarish zone of death and destruction, with Japanese fighter pilots later confessing to firing on Chinese farmers with their machine guns and 20mm cannons for, and I quote, fun. Columns of marching Japanese soldiers also subjected civilians to extreme violence and cruelty, such as in one instance where the occupants of a village named Nanqian-to were locked in their homes by Japanese soldiers under the pretense of imposing a curfew. The soldiers then set fire to the buildings, leaving nothing but ash and embers where the village and its people used to be. When a mother and child returned to find their village in flames, Japanese soldiers threw the woman's 2-year-old into the fire, stabbed her with bayonets, and then tossed her bleeding body into a nearby creek. In another incident, a pregnant Chinese woman was beaten and violated so brutally that she lost the ability to walk. Japanese soldiers then cut open the belly of the pregnant woman, gouged out the fetus, and then rounded up the remaining villagers and bayoneted them to death. A soldier of the Japanese 13th Division, Kurosu Tadanobu, wrote the following account of his unit's activities. We'd take all the men behind the houses and kill them with bayonets and knives. Then we'd lock up the women and children in a single house and violate them at night. Then before we left the next morning, we'd kill all the women and children, and to top it off, we'd set fire to the houses so that even if anyone came back, they wouldn't have a place to live. Another account, attributed to a now anonymous Japanese journalist, attempted to explain the speed of the Japanese advance. The reason that the 10th Army is advancing to Nanking quite rapidly, he said, is due to the tacit consent among the officers and men that they could loot and violate women as much as they wish. Rather than face the horrors of the invading Japanese army, many Chinese civilians chose oblivion, with First Lieutenant Nishizawa Benkichi bearing witness to an incident in which 2 young Chinese ladies chose to drown rather than face capture. Perhaps one of the most infamous atrocities committed on the road to Nanking involved 2 Japanese officers engaging in a little friendly competition, and that competition involved a race to be the first man to behead 100 Chinese prisoners. Second Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda Shin rushed to behead every Chinese captive they could find with their razor-sharp Shin Gunto sabers. The competition was widely reported on in the Tokyo newspaper Nichi Nichi Shinbun, as well as the English-language publication The Japanese Advertiser, with both papers publishing regular updates. For one edition, Nichi Nichi Shinbun's front-page headline read, "Incredible record in contest to cut down 100 people. Mukai 106, Noda 105. Both second lieutenants go to extra innings." Lieutenants Mukai and Noda had such a close tally that it was declared impossible to determine who had been the first to reach 100. Yet instead of calling it a draw, the 2 officers decided to continue their murderous contest until a clear winner could be decided. In the year 2000, revisionist scholars from Japan and the United States argued that the contest had been an elaborate hoax, with the purpose of fostering what they called national fighting spirit. The claim led to a 2005 lawsuit filed by the families of Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, by which they attempted to clear the names of their war criminal forefathers. Yet the suit was promptly dismissed by a Tokyo district judge who stated that the lieutenants admitted the fact that they raced to kill 100 people, and have done so on multiple occasions. On December 8th of 1937, with the Japanese army just 15 miles away from Nanking city walls, Prince Yoshihiko Asaka arrived at the front. He was met by 2 lieutenant generals who proudly informed him that the Japanese had almost completely surrounded the 300,000 Chinese troops in the vicinity of Nanking, and that preliminary negotiations suggested that the Chinese were ready to surrender. However, instead of issuing orders to accept surrendering soldiers as prisoners of war, Prince Asaka signed a now infamous order, instructing his officers to kill all captives. It's also important to remember that the Japanese considered all Chinese men to be combatants, regardless of age or infirmity, meaning that for all intent and purpose, Prince Asaka had given the order to slaughter almost every single person in the city of Nanking. On December 9th, and despite a valiant effort on the part of its Chinese defenders, the Imperial Japanese Army finally reached Nanking's city walls. Then, following an intense 4-day battle, a combination of fatigue and a complete breakdown in command and control led to the collapse of the Chinese resistance. General Tang Shing-chi gave the order to retreat, and while many of his soldiers were able to reach safety, the order had failed to reach the ears of the so-called Chinese Supervisory Unit, who had been issued strict instructions to execute any and all deserters. To their horror, many Chinese soldiers discovered that not only were they being hunted by the Japanese, but their own countrymen were scouring the now shell-scarred cityscape, gunning them down at random. On December 13th, when it became clear that Chinese resistance had been sufficiently worn down, the Japanese army units advanced toward Nanking's city gates and smashed their way inside. That same afternoon, 2 small Japanese Navy fleets arrived on both sides of the Yangtze River, cutting off the escape of anyone hoping to take to its waters. At first, the advancing Japanese soldiers were met with an eerie quiet, but upon advancing deeper into the city, they began encountering pockets of terrified Chinese army holdouts. Having heard the rumors that the Japanese were slaughtering them, many fought to the bitter end rather than face capture. After the Japanese began broadcasting messages to the besieged Chinese, promising them mercy if they laid down their arms, tens of thousands surrendered themselves. However, the Japanese didn't just detain uniformed Chinese soldiers as prisoners, and as previously stated, considered almost all adult males to be enemy combatants. In one incident, around 20,000 Chinese prisoners were led to a so-called detention facility near the village of Mufushan on the banks of the Yangtze River. Each had been told their surrender meant that they would be spared, and were led to a large barbed wire cordon surrounded by Japanese machine guns. They were told the machine guns were for security purposes, forming the ultimate line of defense in the event of a riot among the prisoners. It was a lie. At dawn the next morning, as tens of thousands of Chinese prisoners woke up and began to rise to their feet, the Japanese opened fire with heavy machine guns. Swaths of Chinese prisoners were scythed down like wheat, and in the panic, they rushed the barbed wire cordon. Scores were shot and killed as they attempted to climb over the razor-sharp wire, forming human bridges for other prisoners to scramble over. Soldiers from the Yamada detachment were forced to fire on fleeing prisoners in order to prevent their escape, a storm of lead carving flesh from bone. When it was over, Japanese soldiers had to trudge through a field quite literally soaked with Chinese blood. Then they dragged the bodies, all 20,000 of them, to the edge of the Yangtze, before tossing them into the water. In the space of just a few short minutes, tens of thousands of lives had been needlessly snuffed out, with the river that had once brought them life now swimming with their blood. In other such incidents, Chinese prisoners were used for live bayonet practice, with soldiers being taught to kill with just one strike. Helpless prisoners were tied to wooden stakes, before Japanese soldiers were instructed to plunge their razor-sharp bayonets directly into the prisoners' hearts. Some groups of prisoners were tied together, doused in petrol, then set on fire. Others were beheaded, sometimes dozens at a time, by Japanese officers who wished to perfect their sword strikes. One Japanese officer, Shira Ozuma, later said, "When I tried to behead the first one, either he moved or I misaimed. I ended up slicing off just part of his skull. Blood spurted upwards. I swung again, and that time I killed him." We were taught that we were a superior race since we lived only for the sake of a human god, our emperor, but the Chinese were not, and we held nothing but contempt for them. As the Japanese began to dispense with their so-called mopping-up operations, in which those capable of defending Nanking were slaughtered in their tens of thousands, the city was now ripe for the taking. Mini Vatran, An American missionary who was present during the invasion wrote the following diary entry on December 15th of 1937. "The Japanese have looted widely yesterday and today, having destroyed schools, have killed citizens and violated women. 1,000 disarmed Chinese soldiers whom the International Committee hoped to save were taken from them and by this time are probably shot or bayoneted. Minnie was able to survive the fighting by remaining in what is known as the Nanking Safety Zone, located in the western portion of Nanking and demarcated by symbols of the International Red Cross. The Japanese agreed to steer clear of the safety zone so long as it remained devoid of the Chinese military. The area was established by German businessman and avowed Nazi John Rabe, and became home to the 22 foreign nationals who remained in Nanking following the arrival of the Japanese. This group attempted to provide shelter to as many Chinese civilians as possible, particularly women and girls, and at its peak, the safety zone was said to harbor almost 10,000 vulnerable Chinese. Japanese soldiers were understandably surprised to find a group of foreigners in their midst, especially a group who refused to leave when given the opportunity. But when it was explained that the safety zone was off-limits to them, and on the orders of the superior officers no less, the Japanese generally respected the zone's sanctity. However, John Rabe wrote that, as the days went by, Japanese soldiers began raiding the safety zone to carry off dozens of women at a time. Few ever returned. Throughout the months of December and January, those who remained inside the safety zone began making records of the Japanese war crimes they had personally witnessed. They recorded a total of 450. All were forwarded to the Japanese embassy, and none received a response, and some of them read as follows. Case 5. On the night of December 14th, there were many cases of Japanese soldiers entering homes and violating women or taking them away. This created panic in the area, and hundreds of women moved into the Gingling College campus yesterday. Case 10. On the night of December 15th, a number of Japanese soldiers entered the University of Nanking buildings at Tao Yuan and violated 30 women on the spot. Case 13. On December 18th at 4 p.m., Japanese soldiers demanded a Chinese man hand over his cigarette case. When he hesitated, one of the soldiers thrust his bayonet into the side of the man's head. The man is now at the university hospital and is not expected to live. Case 14. On December 16th, 7 girls, ages ranging from 16 to 21, were taken away by the military college. Only 5 returned, and each girl was violated 6 or 7 times daily. Case 15. There are about 540 refugees crowded at number 83 and 85 on Canton Road. More than 30 women and girls had been violated. The women and children are crying all night. Conditions inside the compound are worse than we can describe. Please give us help. Case 16. A Chinese girl named Lo was shot through the head and killed by a Japanese soldier. The girl was 14 years old. The incident occurred near the Kuling Sai, a noted temple on the border of the refugee zone. Case 19. A 62-year-old woman was attacked in her home at Hanzi-men. The Japanese soldiers decided that she was too old to violate, so they tortured her instead. To their horror, Western observers noticed that Japanese soldiers were targeting Chinese women and girls at an alarming rate. But it wasn't just a handful of platoons or companies engaging in such horrific war crimes. It was the entire Imperial Army, and they were doing so on an industrial scale. Having expected an easy victory over a people they viewed as inferior, the Japanese were frustrated, exhausted, and furious at having faced such dogged resistance. Then, with the city being completely defenseless following their hard-won victory, it created the perfect conditions for one of the worst collective crimes in human history. In the first 4 weeks after the Japanese entered Nanking, there were approximately 20,000 recorded cases of carnal violation, with some experts claiming the real number is around 80,000. If those experts are to be believed, it means that the 50,000 Japanese soldiers that occupied Nanking committed 2 acts of that type of violation per minute for an entire month. Japanese soldiers targeted women of all ages, and in most cases they were executed, then mutilated following what were often group violations. Tokokoro Kozo, a former private in the Japanese army, recalled that women suffered most. No matter how young or old, they all could not escape the fate of being violated. We sent our coal trucks to the city streets and villages to seize a lot of women. and then each of them were allocated to 15 to 20 soldiers for abuse, and after said abuse, we also would kill them. On December 19th of 1937, the Reverend James M. McCollum wrote in his diary, "I know not where to end. Never have I heard or read such brutality. We estimate at least 1,000 cases of violation a night and many by day. In case of resistance or anything that seems like disapproval, there is a bayonet stab or a bullet. People are hysterical. Women are being carried off every morning, afternoon, and evening, and the whole Japanese army seems to be free to go and come as it pleases, and to do whatever it pleases." American reporter Edgar Snow wrote how frequently mothers had to watch their babies beheaded and then submit to violation, while missionary George Finch reported that a woman had her 5-month-old infant deliberately smothered by a brute to stop it while he violated her. Robert O. Wilson, a surgeon at the University Hospital in the safety zone, wrote in a letter to his family, and the extract reads as follows. "The slaughter of civilians is appalling. I could go on for pages telling of cases of violation and brutality almost beyond belief. Last night, the house of one of the Chinese staff members of the university was broken into, and 2 of the women, his relatives, were violated. 2 girls, about 16, were violated to death in one of the refugee camps. In the university middle school, where there are 8,000 people, the Japanese came in 10 times last night and violated until they were satisfied. They bayoneted one little boy of 8 who had 5 bayonet wounds, including one that penetrated his stomach. But I think he will live." Iris Chang, author of one of the most comprehensive accounts of the Nanking Massacre, estimated that the number of Chinese women violated by Japanese soldiers ranged from 20,000 to 80,000. Chang also states that not all victims were women, and that some Chinese men were forced to perform repulsive sex acts as a kind of ritual humiliation. As word of the mass violations made their way up the chain of command, the operations top general expressed intense dismay at the unfolding situation. General Iwane Matsui is said to have told one of his civilian aides, "I now realize that we have unknowingly wrought a most grievous effect on this city. I feel depressed and can never get in a mood to rejoice about this victory. I personally feel sorry for the tragedies of the people, but the army must continue unless China repents." On New Year's Day, General Matsui confided in a Japanese diplomat that "my men have done something very wrong and extremely regrettable." He would later blame the atrocities of the moral decline of the Japanese army, saying, "The Nanking incident was a terrible disgrace. After all our efforts to enhance imperial prestige, everything has been lost in one moment through the brutalities of the soldiers." However, instead of punishing the Japanese troops who were responsible for their atrocities, the Japanese merely decided to open up a series of brothels throughout their occupied territories. Yet these so-called brothels were little more than debauched detention centers where female prisoners were violated in private instead of in public. Following the Japanese surrender in September of 1945, the officers responsible for the atrocities at Nanking were put on trial. General Matsui was indicted for deliberately and recklessly ignoring his legal duty to take adequate steps to secure the observance and prevent breaches of the agreed-upon laws of war. Matsui asserted that he had never ordered the execution of Chinese POWs, arguing that he had directed his army division commanders to discipline their troops for criminal acts and was not responsible for their failure to carry out his directives. Matsui was convicted by a majority of the judges, who ruled that he bore ultimate responsibility for what was called an orgy of crime. Others managed to escape justice entirely, such as Prince Asaka, who was granted immunity as a member of the imperial family, or Isamu Cho, an aide to the prince who committed seppuku during the Battle of Okinawa. Finally, on November 12th of 1948, General Matsui, along with 5 other convicted Class A war criminals, were sentenced to death by hanging. Their sentences were carried out on December 23rd of 1948. Hisao Tani, a lieutenant general who oversaw the massacre, was found guilty of war crimes, sentenced to death, and executed by shooting on April 26th of 1947. That same year, the 2 officers responsible for the contest to behead 100 people, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, were both arrested and extradited to China, and both men were found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death. They were executed by firing squad on January 28th of 1948. In recent years, Revisionist historians have attempted to deny or downplay the horrific events which occurred in Nanking during the winter of 1937. The phenomenon is similar to Holocaust denial, in that it is not only attempting to absolve war criminals of their culpability, but it serves as an insult to the memories of those that were killed. We, as humanity, must always face up to the brutal, unpalatable, or inconvenient truths of the not-so-recent past, for those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations